All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for another great virtual program. My name is Nicole Kramer, and I am the Programming and Partnerships Manager for Memorial Hall Library in Andover. This presentation is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be shared with everyone who registered. If you would like to participate in the program, please put any questions in the Q&A, and we will plan to get to as many of them as we can at the end of the talk. Today's program is in partnership with the Addison Gallery of American Art and the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology, both located on the campus of Phillips Academy right here in Andover. The Peabody Institute has lent several works from their vast collection to the Addison's current installation, Kay WalkingStick, Hudson River School, which is on display through February 2nd. If you have a chance to visit the Addison in the next few weeks, I highly encourage you to visit this exhibition that celebrates a shared reverence for nature while engaging crucial questions about land dispossession and its reclamation by Indigenous peoples, and explores the relationship between Indigenous art and American art history. The Addison is free and open to the public. Today, we are joined by Ryan Wheeler, Director of the Peabody, and Marla Taylor, the Peabody's Curator of Collections, for a discussion about caring for Native American collections and museums' responsibilities in stewarding Native American cultural material. Thank you both so much for being here. I will now turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here to get that started. All right. I'm going to go ahead and assume everybody can see that. So thank you for that introduction, Nicole. Just briefly again, my name is Marla Taylor. I'm the Curator of Collections at the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology at Phillips Academy in Andover. I've been a part of the Peabody Institute since 2008. And Ryan?
I'm Ryan Wheeler. I'm the director of the Peabody Institute, and I've been in this role since 2012.
And we are excited to speak with you all today. And so we're going to go through some topics here and then open this up for questions later in our hour together. So first, just a quick rundown, because I assume many of us are going to be in New England, and this is a conversation that Ryan and I have all the time. The Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology bears the same Peabody name as several other institutions in Massachusetts and New England. So Robert Peabody was the nephew of George Peabody. George Peabody is the person who funded the creation of the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard, the Yale Peabody, and the Peabody Essex in Salem. Robert was his nephew and the executor of George's will and had his own independent wealth also. So while these institutions do share a family name, we are not related to or part of any of these other institutions, just to kind of clarify that quickly. And as Nicole said, we are here to speak with you as part of the programming for the Kay WalkingStick Hudson River School exhibition at the Addison Gallery of American Art. The Addison Gallery and the Peabody Institute are both part of Phillips Academy in Andover and have been building a collaborative relationship around exhibitions for a few years now. Again, as was mentioned, Kay WalkingStick is a contemporary Cherokee artist who focuses on landscape paintings, and she overlays, where did I put it? She overlays Indigenous patterns and abstract Indigenous patterns onto representational landscapes to talk about ownership of landscape forms. And this exhibition includes not just Kay WalkingStick's paintings, but also Native American cultural material from Kay's personal collection and other institutions, including the Peabody Institute. So you can see a couple of those pieces that are on loan there on your screen. About 1 year ago, Gordon Wilkins, one of the curators at the Addison Gallery, approached us here at the Peabody to see if we'd be willing to loan some pieces from the institutional collection to augment Kay's paintings in the exhibition. And now we have worked with the Addison before, and this partnership is a really great way for us to showcase some material from the Peabody while also working to support a contemporary Native artist and, you know, being collegial and partners with our fellow institution on campus. After reviewing the paintings in the exhibition and the Peabody collections, we ended up loaning two Mohican baskets made by unknown members of the Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohican Indians. You can see one there on your screen. Look at the kind of see remnants of the potato stamp design on those yellow strips. You can see that there was a design stamped there in the past. And we also loaned a ceramic vessel made by Ramona Peters, who is an artist from the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe here in Massachusetts. So we're going to speak a little bit about the process for the loan and how the Peabody Institute approaches loans in general a little bit later on in our conversation today. But when Ryan and I were speaking with the Addison staff about contributing programming for the exhibition, we realized that most people who engage with an art museum and art exhibitions would be unfamiliar with the work or best practices involved in caring with Native American cultural items within a museum. And this felt like a great opportunity to engage in this conversation with a wider audience and give you all a glimpse of the work that we do. So that background is going to take us into the conversation that Ryan and I are going to be having with you all today. So first, Ryan is going to give you some background into why and how museums collected Native American cultural material and how the Peabody Institute fits into that larger historical story. I'm going to share how the Peabody has historically cared for the collections at the institution. And then we're going to jump into the present to talk about how the Peabody Institute is now and how the collections are stewarded, accessed, and used both within and beyond Phillips Academy. All right, that one's you, Ryan.
Thanks, Marla. People were like, maybe is Ryan going to talk in the presentation? But he is. So, it's really interesting to think about, the origins of museums and where they come from. A lot of it comes out of, really sort of 18th century scientific thinking, natural history, collecting specimens and exhibiting them. You can see some examples of these so-called cabinets of curiosities, which was kind of an early approach to museums, often with a real hodgepodge of items. I suspect people will be surprised, even those that are very familiar with Phillips Academy, to learn that there was a cabinet of curiosities here on campus. In the early days of this institution. Phillips Academy was founded in 1778, pretty solidly at the end of the 18th century. And, I think a lot of the thinking and teaching that probably went here was really inspired by, that time period. So it's perhaps not too surprising that we had such a thing. Like a lot of these, it went away in a fire. One of the campus buildings that housed this cabinet. So all we have is some lists of the types of items, but they ranged from, beehives that people brought in to, in some cases, probably some Native American stone tools, often things that the students were kind of bringing back to campus with them as these really kind of natural history curiosities. Let's see, maybe we'll go to the next slide. Oh yeah, cool. All right. Well, I'll talk a little bit more about the origins maybe of collecting Native American material culture. People might also be surprised that Thomas Jefferson excavated a Native American mound that was on his plantation property. He was intensely interested in, what was there and potential connections with modern Native people. Though oftentimes, what we see both in that time period and then, pretty well throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century is that there's a real disconnect between archaeologists, anthropologists, historians thinking about Native American material culture and modern indigenous people. Several, and I think this is particularly interesting in looking at Kay WalkingStick's art, where she has taken these really kind of iconic Hudson River School landscapes, then done these overlays where she is kind of calling into question, whose landscapes are these? And by kind of superimposing this native imagery, sort of re-impressing the idea that there's a native connection that may be stronger than other connections that people are feeling or experiencing. I would also say that a lot of the impetus around collecting uh, indigenous material collections, it's a financial one. Franz Boas, who's considered the founder of American anthropology, and often really, I think, lionized as kind of a hero, somebody who, attempted to explode ideas around race and racism, was writing to his wife about, how he could make money by collecting Native American human remains and selling them to museums. So at the cornerstone of a lot of this collecting is money. It's pretty, base. Um, there's some other philosophical things that happen, and they all sort of happen, a lot of them happen around the same time, interestingly enough. In 1879, the federal government establishes something called the Bureau of American Ethnology. And its stated goal was, one of its major goals was to kind of figure out who had made all of these Native American sites that were in the West being sort of the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. And it was a real citizen science effort where they invited people from all over the place who were visiting these areas or lived there to send them information. Um, there was a real dispute about the origin of mounds and earthworks in these places. Were they made by the ancestors of modern native people, or were they made by some sort of fantastic lost cultures of some kind? People that worked at our institution, our first curator was engaged in some of these ideas. And people, it was basically a way to write people out of the landscape, a landscape that, the new citizens of the United States were interested in taking away from the original inhabitants.
The only thing I want to add to what Ryan's saying is that by taking these collections away from their communities, taking these items away and putting them on shelves in a larger organized institution, and then putting them on display, or the institution becoming the way that the public can engage with these collections, the institution becomes the authority on those cultural items and on the cultures that made them, instead of the people who are participants in that culture, right? We start recognizing the authority of the people who amass the collections. And I just wanted to point out that one image here, the larger one on your screen, is from excavations this institution sponsored in New Mexico at Pecos Pueblo. The top one is from, I believe it's from Mesa Verde in New Mexico or Colorado. And the other image I borrowed from the trustees of the reservation. So that's an image that goes with the Fruitlands Museum. So just to get a kind of a snapshot of work that was either sponsored by this institution or people kind of working locally as well.
I think that's a really good point, Marla, is that as people are trained, we have archaeologists and anthropologists who become the experts on somebody else's material culture. And, the sort of wholesale removal of material culture, both ancient items that are being, disturbed at archaeological excavations, but also people taking ceremonial regalia, clothing, weapons, really, whatever, people could get, and often bringing them, really long distances away from their points of origin. Uh, you know, I, I've often sort of, we've spent a lot of time sort of reflecting on, well, why did people take so many items? And I think that, at some point, all of these items are evidence. They're evidence of land tenure. And
Mm.
so they're imbued now with a kind of a new economic value, but also they're, by removing them from where they were, you're sort of removing the evidence of people's ownership of those places and sort of housing them somewhere else. And there was also a real, certainly one of the missions of the Bureau of American Ethnology, something that many people who were trained in anthropology at this time felt that they were um, saving, the last vestiges of a lost race, people that would vanish soon. And certainly, if you look at um, the government's policies of assimilation, um, the end of treaty compliance. It seemed like a reality potentially that there would be a point where there were no native people anymore. That was certainly the desire of the government. And I'll say one other thing before I talk a little bit about the Peabody is that the same year that the Bureau of American Ethnology is founded is this really monumental court case that many people don't know about. It's Standing Bear versus Crook. Standing Bear was a Ponca leader. Uh, George Crook was the army officer who was told to move Standing Bear and his people back to their reservation when they wanted to return to their homelands. They were basically arrested. And the legal case hinges on the idea of habeas corpus, that people have to be charged. You can't just hold them indefinitely. And this was certainly what had been denied to Standing Bear and his followers. And the government's argument was these are not people. We don't have to allow them the right of habeas corpus. And so I think that all of these things are kind of in people's heads, in people's thinking, in how people are being trained um, in terms of in modern indigenous people. And so it's okay to go and remove individuals from a burial site. It's okay to take ceremonial regalia. And so I think those three or four things kind of together, create this environment where so many items can be taken to museums. Now I'm supposed to talk about the Peabody. The Peabody is interesting. Unlike those other institutions that Marla mentioned, the other sort of Peabodys, which were all founded mid 19th century, we were founded in 1901. And we had a different mission in some ways. We were to be the repository for Robert's collection of about 40,000 Native American items that he had amassed with the help of Warren Moorhead, who you can see there in a couple of these photos, who's his sort of personal curator in the 1890s. But throughout much of our history, um, people were doing scientific investigations. So science pretty quickly gets involved in this mix of, indigenous America. And, part of that becomes more systematic removal of items, but also an attempt to answer questions. When did people first come to the Western Hemisphere? Questions about, yeah, you can see some of the other folks that were involved here in the 20th century. Douglas Byers at the Bullbrook site, which is the earliest habitation site in the northeastern United States, not far from here in Ipswich, Massachusetts, with that great paneled truck. Fred Johnson, who was a curator here for many decades, I think about 3 decades, from the 30s to the late 60s, and was really, instrumental in kind of coming up with the idea of environmental archaeology, bringing together teams of specialists from other fields who could, rather than maybe fabulous items, focus on things like pollen or radiocarbon dating. And then those two gentlemen, wound up working with Scotty McNeish, who is also our director here in the 1970s. You can see in the lower corner of your screen. And he was interested in the origins of civilization and agriculture and worked in Mexico, Peru, Belize, China after he was here. And so our collections grew pretty considerably from Robert's, 40,000, more antiquarian collected items to these scientific collections, which number something like 600,000 items plus.
Yeah. So can I jump and build on that, Ryan?
Absolutely.
So you can see here in the upper corner when the collection, that initial 40-ish thousand items from Robert Peabody came here, those are students at Phillips Academy unpacking the boxes that were shipped and placing them into wooden drawers that you can see that up until 2022 still held the collection here at the Peabody Institute. That's a really recent change we'll talk about again in just a moment. So the collections were unpacked. Things were organized largely geographically. They tried to keep sites together through the work of those gentlemen that Ryan was just speaking about and through the work of the institution in the past. The Peabody now is in possession of cultural materials basically from across the United States, with a concentration in the Northeast and the Southwest, but the collection contains materials from all across the country. So things were largely organized geographically. Pieces were put out on display in those exhibit cases that you can see in the bottom there, in the bottom image. Those are no longer on display, but underneath them is where the wooden drawers were initially. And then they were also created custom housing storage in the basement. And oftentimes when collections came in, they would be numbered. So a number would be written in black ink on the item, whether it was a projectile point. Many of you will call them arrowheads. I'm going to call them projectile points. That's the archaeological term for it. So whether they're points or vessels or other broken pieces of ceramic or bone tools or whatever, everything would basically get a number. And then those numbers would be written in the accession ledger that you can see here. And oftentimes we would have a single handwritten line of information. And that's how the items came into the institutional collection, often with just that single line. And that number is kind of the key to decoding that. In those drawers, sometimes there'd be little pieces of paper that would give you kind of some idea as to where something came from or some additional perspective. And they started those numbers with, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 78,400. And I think it's like 86, something like that, before they transitioned numbering systems. So you can see some really great examples of how the collection was originally treated here. And then Ryan was talking about kind of a transition to a focus more on scientific collecting. And so you can see some soil samples in those jars, those carbon samples that could be radiocarbon dated, that could be analyzed through a fine mesh screen to see tiny small pieces of pollen or seed or other small debris that can indicate evidence of everyday life. Materials were placed into these boxes, sometimes with cardboard boxes with plastic bags, and you can see there in the bottom an example of how those wooden drawers were placed into what we would call storage bays. And that picture was a very accurate image. Again, gosh, even up until 2023, that image was a very accurate image. So that's how the collection kind of initially came into the institution, how it was initially cared for and stored. People would be given access for research purposes. There's a lot of research that's been done on this institutional collection. And so you can see some really great examples there. But we wanted to establish that as a little bit of a baseline to talk about how museums have engaged with Native American collections. And this is a lot to cover in a very short period of time. So we're giving just kind of the basics here. So we wanted to pivot a little bit now to the Peabody Institute today and how the approach and framework for stewarding these exact same collections has shifted over time and kind of what we're doing now, as well as what the broader ethical approach for caring for Native American collections in museums is at this point. So, Ryan, interrupt me at any point if I get any of this wrong. We were a gift to Phillips Academy in 1901, like you was saying. We have over 600, the institution has over 600,000 individual Native American items present here. I think the number is higher, but I would have broken our database to try to extract some specific numbers this afternoon. It would have taken way too long. The institution and the collection is integrated into the Phillips Academy curriculum, and I'll definitely let Ryan speak a little bit more on that. And now the institutional focus is really on education with the collection and repatriation as well, which again, we're going to touch on lots of things that could be an hour in and of themselves. So we're trying to move quickly if you can. I'll leave this for you, Ryan.
Oh, okay, great. I forgot when it was my part to take
It's
over.
okay. Okay.
Yeah, as Marla said, and I know we still get a lot of people that stop by or call that want to come and sort of view the museum. And we're always a bit, it's a bit disappointing, I guess, for folks to learn from us that we really don't have any of those exhibit cases anymore filled with items. You can come. We do host the meetings of the local Massachusetts Archaeological Society chapter every third Tuesday. So there's a little plug for them. If you do want to come and visit the building and hear a lecture from that group, September through May. But most of what we've done over the course of really the last 20 plus years is figure out ways that the collections can be used in classes. And we've also really worked hard to try to make sure that whatever perspectives that we're sharing in those classes, especially those that use indigenous collections, that we've built indigenous perspectives and voices into those lessons. And then we've really made a commitment to bringing indigenous artists and speakers, writers, thinkers, activists to campus to work directly with students. You can see a variety of classes going on here. There's a Sioux muslin drawing or a replica of one that we have that's being used in a History 300 class. So that's a U.S. history class. We also have Guatemalan textiles from the mid-20th century that are being used in a Spanish class there. Taino items that are being used, in this case, in an art class, though typically it's our 10th grade history that participates in that lesson. And then our friend Ramson Lamadewoima, who's a Hopi glass artist who's visited campus a couple of times over the last few years to work with English and art classes, doing some fused glass artwork. So yeah, really our model has been programs for faculty and students here.
Yeah, and I would say that the education is an important part, obviously, of what we do. And the foundation for that, and the really important step in stewarding any museum collection, is to understand what is present in an institution. And so I referenced those drawers being around until 2022, and that's because we did a full physical inventory of the collection from 2017 to 2022, where we emptied all of those wooden drawers and transitioned items into archival boxes. And you can see how the boxes kind of fit back into that same drawer slot. You can see in the images there. This inventory was the first time in the 100+ years of history where we got our hands on kind of everything to make sure that we could represent them on the computer with a digital record and then rehouse them into archival bag boxes as appropriate. But it's really an important step because with that inventory, what can we do? We can have better communication with the faculty and students here at Phillips Academy and provide material and information for their classes, research projects, and overall learning experience. We can also have better communication with Native American communities whose cultures are represented within the collection. And, it can be challenging to have conversations with tribes or Native nations if you don't know what you're trying to talk to them about what's in the collection. So getting a handle on what is here was a really foundational step for us. And from that, once we know what's here and can talk about these audiences, I just want to talk about how we sort of facilitate access and have these conversations. And it's really about consent. Um, as Ryan was saying, in classes, we do our best as non-Indigenous individuals ourselves to incorporate those Indigenous voices into students' learning opportunities to the best of our abilities. And that's sort of by forwarding the collections to speak for themselves as primary sources, to make sure that there's resources provided to the students that are written by Indigenous authors or members of the community that they are learning about, and trying to put all of that in there. And when it comes to collection stewardship, we want to have conversations with the tribes and the Native nations whose ancestors or communities made the materials that are physically present at the institution. And so a lot of what we do is kind of having conversations like that and then incorporating requests as we can in order to the care. So, for example, that means something maybe not placed in plastic, something maybe placed in muslin to have a natural container, muslin fabric. It might mean that items used for classes uh, go through kind of a vetting process to ensure that nothing is culturally sensitive or culturally inappropriate to be shared with students, because we are not experts on every Indigenous culture and every single thing in the collection, but we can be experts in understanding how to care for and navigate those conversations and facilitate access to those items. So we actually request consent for research access for anything involved in the collection. I need a copy of a letter from an appropriate tribal representative to provide access for research for destructive analysis, as well as just kind of general physical analysis, and sort of um, forwarding a framework that promotes culturally appropriate care and priorities and puts that Indigenous perspective as much in the forefront as we can.
I,
And
I
go
would
ahead.
I would jump in and just share to Marla that we instituted that policy around collections access. I don't know, it was about 4 years ago, maybe 2021.
It was 2021. Mhm.
And I think we got opinions from a lot of people about what the impacts would be. Was it really going to foreclose research here? Would it still allow for access? And I think our experience over that time is that there have been instances where we have said no to people or not been able to supply what they wanted. But for the most part, I think we've been pleasantly surprised that most researchers are already coming here with having had those conversations and built those relationships with tribal partners. So they're not showing up here cold and then being sort of shocked that they might need to talk to somebody with a tribe or nation that they've done that already. So that's encouraging. Sometimes not, but that's the minority, I think.
I would agree with that. And that approach I wanted to articulate extends to loaning collections and the loan that we facilitated with the Addison. And you can see examples of some other loans here. Again, some at the Addison, some with other institutions, where when we receive a loan request, I do reach out to the appropriate affiliated community and share that loan request with them, um, and ask for their consent to loan that item in the way to the institution that's requesting it. And we share how that item is going to be put on display and kind of what text and language is going to be around it, so they really understand what they're consenting to. And sometimes that can be challenging to work with other institutions who don't have a policy like that, who don't care for Native American cultural materials and are not familiar with asking for consent in that way. And it has led to, some tension a little bit. But I'm happy to say that like we've always gotten the approval when when we've asked, we've made sure that we have the approval for anything that we loan. And if I don't get the authorization, we don't approve the loan. So I'm happy to kind of highlight the collaboration we did for the Kay WalkingStick exhibition, where those two baskets that I referenced earlier, made by the members of the Stockbridge Munchie community, those Mohican baskets, we actually, in conversation with the Stockbridge Muncie, were able to bring out a basket weaver artist also to come and do a hands-on workshop at the Addison to sort of demonstrate that that artwork and that approach is still active within that community, and to really make sure that the Native voice was represented when we're having conversations like this. And I think that was absolutely a success. And I'm really glad that we were able to work with the Addison to coordinate and facilitate that. And I hope we can do that more in the future. There's one other important aspect of how the Peabody Institute cares for collections. And again, this could be a much larger conversation in and of itself, but I'm going to pass this to Ryan to break down.
Well, and I think this is really was a turning point in the relationship between museums and archaeologists and indigenous people, certainly in the United States. So in 1990, the federal government passed a repatriation law called NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And it required institutions like ours to survey their holdings and then be in touch with tribes and make available for repatriation, especially ancestral human remains, but also several other categories of items. And before that, law went into effect in November of 1990. Most archaeologists, many museums really, even though they were holding these collections, had very few touch points with the descendants of the people that had made those items, or the actual descendants of the people that were being held in their collections. And so the law essentially sort of forced all of these groups into conversation with one another. And it was heavily opposed when it was being debated in Congress, and when it ultimately passed. Our big archaeology and museum organizations were very skeptical about what this meant for the future of their fields, the future of museums. I think in retrospect, looking back, it really changed it changed those relationships. It also was significant civil rights legislation that allowed indigenous people to reclaim stolen ancestors, stolen material heritage that was taken really without any consent, certainly no informed or prior consent. Interestingly, the United States is the only country that has a law like this, though certainly many other countries, Canada, Australia, have been working around repatriation and some of these issues as well. Let's see. I don't know what else I can say without launching into another major talk. Oh yeah.
Right. I think just because again, it can be a challenge to talk about this topic briefly. I'll try to summarize a little bit. The NAGPRA as a federal law passed in 1990, had new regulations for implementation of that law that were released in early of 2024. That had an aspect to them that's called the duty of care clause, which builds in a requirement for the first time a requirement for museums to ask for consent and prioritize Native American requests for caring for and access to an exhibition of Native American cultural items. Now, under the law, cultural items, that phrase specifically means materials that are subject to the law of NAGPRA. And the difference between what that kind of outlines, what the Peabody Institute does, is we sort of have integrated that approach prior to those regulations being put forth in January of 2024. We've been doing this at least since 2021 and versions of it before that. And we apply that standard kind of across the collection, whether or not the items that we're caring for and stewarding or providing access to are subject to repatriation under the statutes and the regulations. So I do think that's an important, that approach and that need to care for items informs like everything that we do, what gets utilized in classes, what pictures I am showing you in a presentation. It informs how we do tours through the spaces, how we engage with researchers and have conversations with communities. And so that's a really fundamental, important part of what we do and how we care for the collection. It's a very short version so that we don't have an hour-long conversation. Is there anything I missed, Ryan?
No, I think that's right. Yeah, there's been a couple of the law itself hasn't changed since 1990, but the regulations presented by the National Park Service have evolved several times, and the most recent evolution from January of last year, 2024, introduced this duty of care concept. And also some new deadlines. So people are kind of actively engaging in ways that maybe they hadn't in the past. It eliminated some of the other maybe problematic. It eliminated some of the other attempts to solve problems that didn't seem that created more problems, I guess. So might be one way to think about it. But some of the images that you're seeing are communities that we've worked with either historically in the 1990s, early 2000s, but also more recently. And one of our previous directors, Jim Bradley, in the lower right-hand corner, I think he and Leah Rosenmeyer, who was the repatriation director here in the 90s and early 2000s, really, unlike I think a lot of their peers, recognized that NAGPRA was important and that they needed to comply, not comply, but even go beyond compliance and make sure that they were, putting all efforts into the law. And so I think that's set us up to be the institution that we are today.
So just because we're getting near the end of our time and we had a finite amount of time to have this conversation with you all, I did want to just briefly make you aware that there are resources that exist in the world to talk about Indigenous collections care and how museums should ethically care for and steward Native American cultural materials, but also Indigenous kind of writ large. And there's some great resources there. I don't have an easy way to give you some hyperlinks, but if you Google these things, information and materials will pop up. And so
take a screenshot and
yes,
look them up later.
Yes. Or watch the recording. You need to see this again. Okay, so here we'll just pause and put our emails up for anyone to ask us questions later that may occur to you, and we'll ask Nicole to send us any questions that came in.
Great, and I will be sending a follow-up email to everyone today, so I can get those links and gather them together for people if they're interested in exploring some more. Well, thank you both for sharing so much information with us. We do have some questions that have come in. One thing that has come up is, so you shared quite a bit about how, you reach out for consent when you're working with certain parts of your collection. one question is, how do people who may have a connection to your collection, tribal nations that may have a connection, is there a way for them to find out what you have, or is it mostly you reaching out to them?
It's a little bit of both. And so when it comes to materials subject to repatriation under NAGPRA, we have federal requirements to submit summaries or inventories under the law to the National NAGPRA program, as well as to potentially affiliated communities. So yes, we send that out. Some complicated gray areas there. So we're reassessing that and making sure that all of that is available. But there are some collections available online as well, and we respond to inquiries and kind of through word of mouth. Fortunately, an institution that's been around as long as we have, who's worked, past directors have excavated some very prominent archaeological sites. People tend to be aware of the collection on some level. So a little bit of both.
And another question on kind of going along with the getting consent. Do the people you reach out to normally consent to sharing the artifacts, or what's kind of a normal response when you reach out?
Depends.
We've definitely had tribes, reject research requests. They felt like the items that were being requested, in many cases were either funerary items or unassociated funerary items, two of the categories covered by NAGPRA. But in other cases, people haven't really necessarily had a problem. So I think it's a minority when we've had negative responses.
And I think that's partly, Nicole, because if I already know that it's not appropriate, or Ryan already knows that it's not appropriate, we won't let it get to that point, right? Like, we're asking questions if we're unsure. And I've gotten consent from tribal communities where they've said, sure, but could you please put a picture of the artist along with the exhibition tag so she becomes a real person? It's like, yes, absolutely, we can honor that request. And so you have a back and forth like that as well.
Yeah, I think usually, absolutely, like we wouldn't, go and talk to the tribe if we kind of know the answer is going to be no, but we would convey to the researcher or whoever was asking for access that, they needed to go and maybe work on building those relationships. And as I said before, many times they come with that. So that's been encouraging.
Yeah. A lot of collaboration and thought needs to go into it. Makes a lot of sense. A couple questions about sort of the collections that you have. Someone wanted to know if you have any local native artifacts that were found like here in Andover.
Yes, yes. There is a lot of collecting locally. Yes.
And someone else in a similar vein wanted to know if there were parts of the collection that are from the Wampanoag communities besides your recent accession of Ramona Peters vessels.
There's a lot of material that originated with the Wampanoag communities. Yes. From the Cape area in particular. Yes.
Mostly archaeological.
Yeah.
So ancient items that people here, some of those folks that you saw pictures of, they did various projects in southeastern Massachusetts, in Wampanoag homelands. Not as many more contemporary pieces, though. Yeah.
There's another question. Do most of the Native American groups and tribes that you connect with allow you to steward the artifacts in your collection, or do a lot of them want to reclaim them, or is there a process for that?
Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah. Oh, so under the federal repatriation law, a big part of it is the return, the repatriation. So there's been quite a bit of that type of work that we've been able to support and engaged in. In some cases there may be you know, uh, uh, there may be work that needs to be done to reunify holdings that have been divided across institutions. And so that might mean that it takes an awfully long time to get to a point where the return actually happens. Um, but I even just within the last few months, we've been involved in, since the summer, we've been involved in, a number of repatriations, and we are always engaged in kind of ongoing consultation around returns as well.
Yeah. And I think the kind of core of that individual's question is,
Hmm.
are you giving all the collections away back to the communities, or are there still going to be collections at the institution? Which is something that kind of comes up. So if a community requests a repatriation, we always have those conversations. Um, there are multiple communities that we've engaged with who say, we don't need that back. You go ahead and hold on to it. It's fine. Let me give you some additional information about it. That's great. Go ahead and use it as a learning opportunity. There's really no one monolithic answer, but the institution's definitely going to continue to have a collection.
Mhm.
Um, just making sure I'm not missing anything. There's lots of questions here. Um, Someone was curious if there are any Indigenous curators on staff or people who maybe have been contracted to work with the museum.
None of the current staff are Native or Indigenous in our ethnic heritage or our cultural heritage. Depending on the project, we could reach out and include tribal representation. I will say on our advisory committee, or our Peabody Board of Advisors, we've worked to have, I think there's at least one person who is Indigenous. And on our collections committee, which is like a subset of that, I have two tribal historic preservation office representatives. So they are part of conversations and decisions made around the care and stewardship of the collection.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of conversation and collaboration. Um, Someone wanted to know, so it seems that in our conversations and your discussion of NAGPRA, that the Peabody has always taken the ethical lead in it, complying and embracing and going beyond NAGPRA. Um, any comments on how other institutions handle it, and if there's any why they might be reticent to comply or embrace it?
I think uh, I think one of the things that happens is that a lot of times what we learned in graduate school or in our early careers is really contrary to kind of contemporary best practices around Indigenous collections care. And so I think kind of making that, giving ourselves permission to kind of make a break with what we learned and, kind of learn new things. I mean, one of the things that I've frequently said is that we're really fortunate that a lot of the tribal representatives and elders um, that we've met have been really kind and patient and been willing to kind of provide that learning that we didn't get when we were in school. Ramona, whose vessel people saw, was one of those people. She was the Mashpee Wampanoag Tippo when I first started working here, and we got to know her fairly well, and learned a lot from her about approaches to NAGPRA, and also just kind of collections care in general. In terms of other institutions, I think that since the regulations, the NAGPRA regulations changed about a year ago, I think that people are, and there's also a lot of younger people from more diverse backgrounds that work at institutions now, that are kind of bringing, other kind of perspectives that, sort of value indigenous voices, perspectives. And so, I think there's even just in the course of the last 12 months been a big shift.
Well, we're rounding on 4 o'clock here, so we can wrap things up. But I thank you both so much for taking the time to share about your work, the role of the museum, and everything that is happening in this realm. I know there were lots of questions. For anyone who is curious, we did record today's presentation, so if you missed some of the beginning or you want to go back and revisit any part of the conversation, you'll be able to do that. I will send those links that were on that last slide to everyone as well. And again, I thank you both so much for taking the time to be here with us. And I thank everyone who attended as well.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. And our emails are in the presentation. You are welcome to send Ryan and I additional questions. I saw there were some more detailed ones in the Q&A. If that's you and you still want to ask, feel free to send an email.
Great.
Thank you all.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.